Hello, my name is April Cohrs. This is my final project for History 3301 with Dr. Jackson at Central State University. The period of Reconstruction was an effort by the government to encourage freedom of slaves, only to be sabotaged by white Southerners. Nevertheless, the Reconstruction era is a turning point in the history of Black Americans and their progression to rights and freedom. According to the National Humanities Center, efforts that Congress instated and endorsed were the 1861 presidential inauguration of Abraham Lincoln, the 1863 Emancipation Proclamation, the 13th Amendment in 1865, and the passing of the Reconstruction Acts in 1867. In 1868, the 14th Amendment was made. Ulysses S. Grant, Republican, was inaugurated in 1869 and again in 1873. The 15th Amendment was signed in 1870. The Civil Rights Act was passed in 1875. President Hayes, Republican, was elected in 1877. President Garfield, Republican, was elected in 1881. And there are civil rights cases in 1883. In 1861, Abraham Lincoln and Hannibal Hamlin become president and vice president, both Republicans. The Civil War begins with the Confederate attack on Fort Sumter in Charleston Harbor. 1862, Congress bans slavery in the territories and the District of Columbia. In 1863, the Emancipation Proclamation is signed by President Lincoln, freeing the slaves in the Confederate States. The all-black 54th Massachusetts Volunteers charges Fort Wagner in Charleston, South Carolina. In 1864, Black Union and Confederate soldiers fight in battles throughout the South. Congressional Medal of Honors is awarded to 24 African American soldiers after the war. In 1865, the presidential inauguration of Abraham Lincoln and Vice President Andrew Johnson. The Civil War ends. 4 million enslaved African Americans are free, including Booker T. Washington. Then Lincoln is assassinated in Washington, D.C. The 13th Amendment bans slavery in the U.S. Our textbook reads that by freeing the slaves, the 13th Amendment had nullified the Three-Fifths Compromise, making it possible for the South to return with even greater congressional representation than before the war. No longer would 4 million slaves be counted as 3/5 of a person for the purposes of either taxation or congressional appointment. Events during this time period were Freedmen's Bureau is established, then it is closed in 1872. Colored Citizens Convention throughout the South issue calls for equal rights and suffrage. The Ku Klux Klan is organized in Tennessee. The first black codes are passed in Mississippi. The convict lease system spreads throughout the South. Sharecropping becomes institutionalized in the South. By 1866, Black leaders, including Frederick Douglass, present Black goals of equal rights and suffrage to President Johnson. Winslow Homer completes the painting, known as At the Cabin Door. Reconstruction Acts are passed by Congress. Howard University in D.C., Morehouse College, Georgia, and Atlanta University are founded. Edmonia Lewis sculpts Forever Free in marble while studying in Rome. Over 600 African Americans immigrate to Liberia on the Golconda. In 1868, the 14th Amendment, according to our textbook, says each of the states was ordered to hold a new constitutional convention based on universal male suffrage, and no state was to be admitted until it ratified the 14th Amendment, which guaranteed the citizenship of all persons born or naturalized in the United States, and thus overturned the Supreme Court's Dred Scott decision. In 1867, President Johnson was elected. This directly affected African Americans in the 14th Amendment's prohibition against state laws that bridged the civil rights of citizens or denied equal protection of the laws. Interestingly, the amendment created divisions in the old abolitionist vanguard. Since the 14th Amendment explicitly identified a congressional appointment penalty for any state that abridged the voting rights of male inhabitants, suffragettes Elizabeth Cady Stanton, Susan B. Anthony, and similarly minded women condemned this gendered language and formed the American Equal Rights Association, outraged that the vote would not be universally extended at this propitious time of sweeping social and political change. Grants citizenship to African Americans and guarantees equal protection of the laws to all U.S. citizens. There's an attempt to impeach President Johnson for his opposition to Reconstruction policy, which fails. The Freedmen's Bureau publishes regular reports of mob violence and intimidation in the South. Hampton Institute is founded in Hampton, Virginia. W.E.B. Du Bois is born in Massachusetts of free black parents. In 1873, the presidential inauguration is Ulysses S. Grant and Vice President Henry Wilson, both Republicans. The 43rd Congress includes 7 black members. Slaughterhouses cases, U.S. Supreme Court rules that the 14th Amendment guarantee of equal protection of the laws extend only to federal civil rights, thus removing Southern states from the duty of protect the civil rights of African Americans. In 1874, Father Patrick F. Healy becomes the first black president of a predominantly white university at Georgetown. The 15th Amendment grants suffrage to African Americans. Our text reads, with the ratification of the 15th Amendment in 1870, black men in the southern states and in the nation as a whole, most northern states denied the vote to blacks, finally gained the right to vote on an equal basis with white men. This far-reaching achievement, the creation of black electorate, had the greatest effect in the former Confederacy, where black men not only voted, but also held elected office at the national, state, and local levels. U.S. Senate holds hearings to investigate violence against blacks in the South. In 1871, the 42nd Congress includes 5 black members. Jubilee Singers of Fisk University conduct first national tour. In 1872, in this period, Southern blacks are elected legislators and state officials. PBS Pinchback serves briefly as governor of Louisiana, the only black state governor until 1990. In 1875, Civil Rights Act is passed by the Congress granting equal rights to black citizens in public accommodations and jury duty. The 44th Congress includes 8 black members. The first Jim Crow legislation to segregate public transportation is passed in Tennessee, as well as a vagrancy law and a contract labor law to assert more control over black labor. Mob violence against blacks in Mississippi leads President Grant to send federal troops to the state. The Convention of Colored Newspapermen is held in Cincinnati. In 1876, Edward Boucher becomes the first African American to earn a PhD from an American university. Winslow Homer completes the painting Visit from the Old Mistress. In 1877, presidential inauguration, Rutherford Hayes and Vice President William Wheeler, Republicans, 45th Congress, includes 4 black members. Reconstruction ends with the Hayes-Tilden Compromise. Union troops end the occupation of the former Confederacy and their protection of Southern black citizens. Whites soon regain political control and eradicate black involvement. In 1878, over 200 African American immigrants sailed to Liberia on the Azore. In 1879, the black exodus begins. Thousands of Southern blacks migrate to Kansas, many inspired by black businessmen. Benjamin Poppy Singleton. White groups, fearful of losing the South's black labor force, organized to discourage or intimidate blacks from migrating west. The 46th Congress includes one black member. In 1880, the 10th census, U.S. population totals 50.1 million, including 6.6 African Americans. U.S. Senate holds hearings on the Negro exodus from the South. Lynchings begin. In the scholarly article, The Meaning of Freedom in the Age of Emancipation by Eric Foner, he states that the meaning of freedom has never been a fixed category or a predetermined concept. Subject to multiple and conflicting interpretations, it has always been a terrain of struggle, its definition constantly created and recreated. Different peoples and groups and different parties within particular groups have experienced and interpreted freedom in different ways, and each has challenged how others use the word. The meanings of freedom have been constructed not only in congressional debates and political treaties, but on plantations and picket lines, in parlors and bedrooms. Freedom has been invoked by those in power to legitimate their aims and seized upon by others seeking radically to transform society. People have so manipulated the concept of freedom, Theodore Adorno complained, that it finally boils down to the right of the stronger and the richer to take from the weaker and poorer whatever they still have. Events that undermined Reconstruction, leading to its end, began in 1885 when Grover Cleveland, Democrat, was elected president. African American slave lynchings escalated, and white Southern hatred escalated. In 1890, disenfranchisement began as Jim Crow legislation was enacted. Cleveland was reelected in 1893. The Plessy v. Ferguson case upholds the separate but equal Jim Crow agenda. Laws that affected the failure of Reconstruction began when, in 1868, as the 14th Amendment was being ratified, Thomas McIntyre Cooley published constitutional limitations. According to Phillip Paludan in Law of the Failure of Reconstruction, the case of Thomas Cooley, it was a propitious conjunction of circumstances. The amendment was an attempt to limit the ability of states to infringe upon the liberties of their citizens. Cooley's book was lucid and learned discussion of the restrictions imposed by the Constitution on the legislative powers of the states. Men who sought to determine how the amendment affected the exercise of state power in the post-Civil War world soon came to regard constitutional limitations as authoritative and indispensable. As the importance of the amendment expanded, so did Cooley's reputation. It became America's second constitution. Cooley became the most influential legal author of the late 19th and early 20th centuries, pervading the hundreds of cases, principles, and illustrations of constitutional limitations was fundamental Jackson faith in equity. Equality of rights, privileges, and capacities, Cooley wrote, unquestionably should be the aim of the law. Further, he emphasized that the word liberty had broad meaning. It was not con to acting as a code word to defend intrusions upon property. The right word embraces all our liberties, personal, civil, and political. Freedom of worship, of speech, the right of self-defense against lawful violence, the right to attend the public schools, the equal right to buy and sell, all were included. Looking back in 1873 at the civil amendments, Cooley saw a culmination of Jacksonian admitted that freedom is no longer sectional or partial. He exulted. There are privileged classes. Apparently, persons who needed protection for their liberties would now receive it. Corporate people did. Black people did not. With amazing swiftness, lawyers and judges made the 14th Amendment, intended to protect Negro freedom, into corporate property, and they used Cooley's writings as their instrument. Again and again, counsel turned to constitutional limitations to argue that their clients might not be deprived of liberty or property without due process of law. With equal frequency, the bench cited the same book to agree with them and to strike down the state regulatory laws. The power of corporations increased as the century passed, and national constitutional guarantees secured the environment of their growth. Meanwhile, the position of the freedom declined. The nationwide announcement of their access to equal liberty ceased to resound. Soon they became the prisoners of state laws, local custom, and private violence. Penned in by federalism, they could only watch the progress of the corporate giants who had stolen their amendment from them. Although he intended neither industrial growth nor the Negro's decline, Cooley's writings were an important vehicle in the accomplishment of both. His role in the first has been described. His importance in the second requires attention. Basic to the understanding of the legal and constitutional problems of Cooley and his era is a recognition that the men who struggled with them were products of Andrew Jackson's America.